Thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick.
It's a treat, Valerie.
I am so thrilled to be speaking to you about your latest book, Mother's Boy. There's so many things I want to ask you because you've had a long career and you've done, really interesting things. But let's just start with this book. For readers who haven't got a copy for themselves yet, can you tell us what it's about?
Yes, it's based very loosely on the life story of a great Cornish poet, Charles Causley. A lot of people, when I mention him, say, "Oh, I've never heard of him." So I always add, he's the poet who wrote Timothy Winters, which is a poem lots of people have to learn when they're in school. And it's about him and his mother, and it takes them through the years just before the First World War, right through till after the Second World War. So it's quite an epic, I guess.
So you're obviously really into Charles Causley because you're the patron of the Charles Causley Trust. And why are you so into Charles Causley? But more importantly, why did you want to write a book about him?
Okay, well, I'm very into Charles Causley because he is the most wonderful poet, and he's not well enough known. So writing a novel about him, partly, I just thought was a great way of spreading the word. And I get very excited when people read the novel and immediately go to Google and Google Charles Causley poems, because I know my job is done then. But the main reason I wrote the book was, having become slightly obsessed with Causley, I then realized there was a great big unanswered question in his life story, which only fiction could answer. I've done this before, sometimes, especially with historical fiction. It's a really good way of joining the dots between the known facts. There are things we'll never know for sure, but fiction can actually join them together. And in Causley's case, I wanted to know why the hell he chose to lead such a quiet life. Because he went away to war. He had this incredible adventure. I mean, horrific adventure, but it was an adventure. His eyes were opened, his horizons were widened. And then after the war, he chose to come back to this tiny little town where he'd grown up in Launceston, in the north of Cornwall, and live with his mother for all her life, which was a long life, and teach in a little tiny primary school where he had been a child. So he actively chose to turn his back on the world in a way.
So you refer to it as a novel, you refer to it as fiction, and you say that it's loosely based on Charles Causley, but the character is Charles Causley. His mother is Laura, you have stuck to the facts. So how much truth and how much fiction is in it?
Well, as I said, it honors the known facts, but there are lots of gaps. And of course, what it does, which a biography wouldn't do, not a good biography, is it gives us his thoughts and her thoughts. So it's a very intimate, internal kind of novel. It's as much about the growth of his feelings as it is about the growth of his body. And similarly with Laura, it dares to imagine things in her head, which no biographer would.
So, as you say, it does depict his thoughts, and because you write it from mainly Laura's point of view and also Charles's point of view in like third person close focus, and you really capture what's going on in each of their heads. But what's interesting is that you have to write Charles as a 5-year-old, as a kid going to school, as a teenager, as an older teenager. So you have actually captured his voice at very, very different ages. So I'm curious to know, from the craft of writing point of view, how do you get into the head of a 5-year-old and but not just a 5-year-old, all the different ages, and really capture that period in time? What did you do to do that?
I even do a very short chapter of him as a baby.
Yes.
I was helped in part by his poems, because Charles wrote a lot of poems that conjure up different points in his childhood and his youth. So I didn't borrow the words, but I felt confident depicting certain scenes because he had depicted them himself. When anybody ever asked him when he was an old man, "Charles, you've had such an amazing life, why don't you write your memoirs?" he always gave the same answer, which was, I don't need to because it's all in the poems. So I took that as that was a red rag to my bull. I thought, right, Charles Causley, I'm going to take your poems to bits and find all the secrets in there. But also I made use of his diaries, because he kept these tiny secret diaries from when he was about 16 years old, 15 or 16, right through until the point in the Second World War where he realized it was pretty much illegal to be writing all this stuff down. And they're not exciting diaries. They will never be published because they literally have things like what he ate for supper and what the latest film was that he saw. But from my point of view, they gave me a really strong sense of what sparked him, what he liked, what he didn't like, the kind of people he was drawn to, and crucially, how his friendships worked. Because the diaries depict these very, very important close friendships he had when he was a young man, which of course were all shattered by the war. I mean, this was a man who I think more than anything else became a poet and a great war poet out of survivor's guilt, because most of his friends were killed in the war. All his shipmates were killed. He, I think, felt very strongly he should have died and hadn't died. He'd been spared, and he'd been spared for a reason. So he goes to war as a playwright, and he comes back a poet, which is that also really intrigued me. And I wanted to try to pinpoint the process by which he turns into a poet.
Now, I have to admit that it wasn't till I got to the end that I realised that it was based on Charles Causley, right?
Good. Because I think if you'd known in advance, you might have thought, oh, well, that's not for me because I've never heard of this man. And I think this is an example of how fiction can change your life, because now you've read the novel, I hope you will at least Google one Charles Causley poem. I think sometimes if you're told in advance that a novel is very, very, and I'm ruining it now, of course, by giving this interview. If you're told in advance that a novel is heavily based on facts, you might think, oh well, then why should I read it? Because I'd rather read a totally factual book. But as I said, I think fiction can blend the two in a really useful way and can bring the facts to life.
Oh yeah, it's brilliantly done. So I want to know, because obviously you are obsessed with Charles Causley and have, been for some time. When did that start? And if you have been that way for a while, what was the trigger that made you finally go, I'm going to write a book about it?
Okay, it was a process of accidents, really. I knew some of his poems when I was very little. Like a lot of English schoolboys, I read Timothy Winters when I was about 11 or 10. That's a wonderful, very funny, very brutal poem about a neglected child, which lots of children, certainly in the UK, at some point will read or have to learn by heart. And then I kind of forgot about him until I moved to Cornwall. And then in Cornwall, where I moved when I was 25, I kept meeting people who knew him. They kept saying, oh, you must come and meet Charles Causley, because he was still alive then. And I never did. I was a bit shy. He was a grand old man of letters. I was just starting out, and it just never happened. And then out of the blue, I was approached by the Charles Causley Trust. This is the charity that was set up after his death to preserve his memory and crucially preserve his last house. And they said, would you become a trustee? Because we think you have a lot to give the trust. And at that point, I said, well, this is a bit embarrassing because I don't really know his work that well. But okay. And then I put myself through a kind of Charles Causley, I put myself through a sort of Charles Causley total immersion course and read everything I could find. And the more I read, the more I found out about his life. And that's when the novelist in me started thinking, this could make a really interesting novel.
Really?
Not just because of him, but because of his mother. Because the thing about Charles Causley, he was born into really unpromising circumstances. I mean, the family, they were laborers. His mother was a laundress. They had very little money. They certainly had very few books. This is not a bookish household, and yet he was a kind of genius. And I immediately thought, wow, what must it have been like for Laura, his mother, to have realized that this little boy that she was raising all on her own was actually pretty damn special, and different from all the other children. Would she have tried to make him more like the other boys? Would she have encouraged him? What went on there? And that really intrigued me. And that's not written down in any book. So I had to write it for myself. I had to imagine it for myself.
So what was the gestation period then? You kind of start reading his poems and then you go, this could make a good novel. Did you actually think about it for quite a while, or did you get started straight away?
No, I thought about it for quite a while. And really the trigger ultimately was that I kept having to go to Launceston, the town where he and Laura lived, because that's where the trust meetings happened. And I would walk, I knew the town quite well, but I found I was walking around its little streets with his poems in my head now, and seeing, oh my God, that's where that poem said. And the town itself became like a character to me. It was coming to life through his poetry. And at that point I thought, I've got this idea isn't going away. I'm going to have to write it.
Wow. So just for listeners, especially Australian listeners, the town that Patrick is referring to, Launceston, we have a town in Tasmania, but
in Tassie, yeah.
Yes, that's right. It's pronounced Launceston. So it's actually spelt the same way, and no doubt it was named after that town. So take me back to, you said that, you were starting out when you moved to Cornwall, when you first kind of heard of Charles. When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, I never knew. I just sort of was one. I mean, when I think back to my childhood, I was writing all the time. I was reading and writing, and the two processes almost were like a circle to me. I couldn't differentiate them. And thank God, nobody encouraged me too much. I was the youngest child, which helps. I think if you're the youngest of four, your mother is so exhausted. She's just happy you're quiet and just leaves you to get on with it. And really, for most of my childhood and my teenage years, I wanted to be a musician. That was the thing I was obsessed with. The writing just happened in the background. And then I became obsessed with becoming an actor. And I was doing that really seriously all through my time at university. And I applied for drama school and everything. And even then I was thinking, well, I like writing, but it's just something I'll do in the background. I never thought it would be a job. And I was actually trying to become an actor and to get my equity card to join the Actors Union when I wrote my first novel. And I wrote my first novel really just to amuse myself. And it was only when an agent said, hang on, I think I could sell this, that I began to think, well, maybe I could do this alongside acting. And actually the acting has never happened, and the novel writing really took off. But I still, to this day, I mean, my word, I've done, 17 novels now. I still can't quite believe I'm getting away with it. I feel as if I've somehow avoided ever having a proper job.
So that first novel, actually your first two novels were published in the same year. And that's correct, right? Your first two novels were published on the same day. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but at that point, did you kind of think this is it, this is going to be my career? Or were you still thinking it's a sideline?
Yeah, I was still thinking it would be a sideline because I didn't have that much self-belief in my ability as a writer. And I had at least to start with, a pretty zany imagination. And my early novels, as anyone will know who digs them out, they're pretty mad. And I thought I was just too left field to interest the general reader. And I think if I try to map it out, I think what happened is gradually, as I got more readers, I calmed down as a writer, and I began to have more confidence in my ability to hold an audience simply by telling them a story. And the funny thing is, the acting hasn't gone away, because of course now I record all my books as audiobooks, so I get to do all the voices. and increasingly writers are expected to perform their work at book festivals to readers aloud. So I get my acting out of my system that way.
All right. So talking about acting, sort of related to that, I was, cruising around Netflix or some streaming service only like about a month ago, and I come across Man in an Orange Shirt. And I was floored, absolutely loved it. And then I start Googling. Okay. And I see written by Patrick Gale. And okay. So tell me about what made you decide to go into screenwriting?
Well, I'd actually been doing it quite a long time, but just in a totally invisible way. Quite often, producers need a script. They bought the rights to a book and they can't push the project on until they have a script. And they look around often for a cheap writer who will just do them a script they can then show to the money man. And I'd done that a few times. I'd written scripts of films which never got made. I'd written scripts of TV shows which went no further. So I'd worked on my craft. And the real breakthrough came when the BBC were looking they knew they wanted some kind of drama series to mark the centenary, the 50 years that have passed since the partial decriminalization of homosexuality. So in the whenevers, when it was still totally illegal to be gay. And they wanted to mark that with a drama. And they were talking, the head of drama at the BBC was talking to a producer and said, what I'm really looking for is something that has the flavor of a Patrick Gale novel. And she didn't know that I wrote scripts or anything. And he went back to the office and reported this. And one of the women he worked with said, "Oh, I know Patrick Gale. We used to play bridge together. I can get in touch with him." So quite by chance, I then got this phone call saying, "Would you be interested in this project?" And I said, absolutely, I would. But the BBC has to know that the thing I write won't be a straightforward celebration saying it was awful then, it's wonderful now. It will be challenging, and it will be as much about the women as about the men, because that's how I'm wired. And thank God they went for it, because I think it took a long time to come to screen. We went through lots of different versions of it. But what you've got now, those two films which relate to each other, which have the same characters at different times of their lives, they're deeply personal to me. And I think they do have the feeling still of a Patrick Gale novel.
Oh, yes, yes.
Especially in the way the women's feelings are quite foregrounded, but also they're not straightforward. So they're very ambiguous characterizations. People don't behave well.
So I have to ask, you say you wrote scripts before, so it was not a foreign process to you, but were those scripts that you wrote before, were they the screen adaptations of your books and therefore the story already existed, or were they, from scratch stories as this was?
It was a total mixture. So I'd adapted a couple of my novels as films, neither of which sadly got made. I'd also written several episodes for a TV series, a drama series that wasn't my idea at all. I was just a writer for hire, but I had those under my belt as proof I could do it. Okay. And I also developed a couple of film and TV series ideas from scratch. So I'd sort of done the whole gamut.
Right.
The nice thing is, because that show did so well and it won an Emmy, I am now getting taken more seriously as a screenwriter, but it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it's still an uphill struggle in the UK to get certainly an independent film financed.
So obviously writing for the screen is very different, and you've got to take into account so many different things. What was the experience like, and what do you prefer? Compared to novels?
It's funny. It's 50-50, because the thing I love about working on scripts is the process is really collaborative. You tend not to be working all on your own for years on end. You're constantly getting feedback. Because there's so much more money involved, the producers want to know what you're doing. So they want to see and talk to you all the time. Whereas when you work on a novel, you are very, very much alone. And it's quite a neurotic, isolated process. The thing I love about writing a novel is I know now it will see the light of day. It will get published. I'm very lucky in that position. Whereas with scripts, I put my heart and my soul into a project, and often it then stalls, which is hugely frustrating. So I've spent, for instance, a year and a half working on a BBC adaptation of Edith Wharton's masterpiece, The Age of Innocence. only to have the BBC suddenly pull the plug. They just said, well, no, we love your scripts, but we're not really doing this sort of drama at the moment. And you have no power. You feel totally powerless. You've been paid, but you have no power. Whereas with a novel, as a novelist, I still have some power,
Yes.
which helps. So I like to go between the two, I guess.
So you have written 17 novels now, and so you're quite the veteran. So can you take us through just a little bit of your, for a typical book? So you pick your idea of your typical experience of writing a book. What period of time does it usually take you for that, first draft, or where you get it to a stage that you're kind of, more or less happy with it? And during that time, are you 100% focused? You wake up and tell me about your writing routine.
Okay. Well, I usually spend about a year avoiding writing. So I know what I'm writing next. I know. So at the moment, right now, where I'm about to start promoting Mother's Boy, I know exactly what my next novel is going to be. And I'm already working on it in my head. But I'm actively avoiding writing anything down. I'm not committing anything to paper yet. I'm letting it grow in my head. And I'm going to do lots of little research trips around that book. I know where it's set. I know the cities where it happens. I need to go to those places, walk the streets, listen to the accents. And it's a slow, organic process. And I think in about 8 months' time, I will be ready to start writing stuff down. And even then, I won't start writing the actual novel. I'll start doing a lot of research. I'm a great researcher. I like to embed myself in the subject that the book is about, and I will take lots and lots of notes. And gradually, the story will take shape. So with my next novel, it's a sequel of sorts to my novel, A Place Called Winter. So it's about real people. But in this case, it's about my grandmother and my mother and their marriages. And Harry Kane, the hero of A Place Called Winter, is the sort of man who makes the plot happen, which he did in 1953 by announcing that he was coming back to England from Canada. So I've got boxes of letters on the shelves behind me between my mother and my grandmother, and they're like a powder keg. And I know I will quite soon sit down and start rereading them all and making notes from them. And the story will grow organically. But once I begin actually to write, I'm pretty fast.
How fast?
It'll take me about a year probably to write the novel, but I write in ink. I'm very old-fashioned. I know when I say this to children, they look at me as if I was about to pluck a quill out of a passing goose. I've just found over the years writing in ink really suits me. It's organic, it's messy like gardening, and it lets the story grow at its own pace. And I seem to write in ink at roughly the speed that I think. So I don't think very fast. I'm a very quick typist, but if I type creative work in a weird sort of way, it becomes facile. I need the pen like a kind of brake on my brain to stop me going too fast.
Okay, let's talk about that. You write in ink, so I have to ask: do you have a chosen journal or book, so it's all, or do you write on loose leaf? I actually want to know what it actually looks like, and
I could show you if you like.
I would love to see.
Okay, well, hang on, I'll get it off the shelf.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so here we have Mrs. Mother's Boy. It's three volumes, and they are completely illegible, I suspect.
Oh wow!
To most people. And what I've done for a long time now is I write the novel in one direction from one end of the book, and I take notes at the other end of the book.
Oh my goodness.
And then I keep up that process until the two sides meet. And then I put that aside and I pick up another notebook and carry on. So they tend to be hardback notebooks because I find these nice and portable. And they often end up with all sorts of scraps of paper tucked into them and biscuit wrappers and heaven knows what else. But it works for me. It's a nice process. And I find when I'm talking to creative writing students, I always say, look, have a go at inky writing. Because if nothing else, if you sit down at your desk and you realize you're having a bad day, the story just isn't coming, you can then spend an hour or two simply going over your notes and looking at your scribbles, and it will remind you, it'll get you back to the good place where the writing was working well.
Okay, so when you held that up to the screen and you casually said, oh, it's probably not very legible, the extraordinary thing was that it was extremely legible. It was also extremely neat, and there were no crossing outs.
I showed you the wrong page. I showed you the wrong page. Believe me, there are crossings out. Okay, there's a pretty messy page. No,
that's not that messy. I'm sorry, because what I think is interesting is, so tell me, when you're writing it in ink, and then you might go and make a cup of tea and think, oh, actually that doesn't work. Do you actually just get rid of pages, or do you leave it all there and kind of at a later stage type it up and move it around?
You see, this is crucial to inky writing. You cross it out when it's wrong, but you can still read it. So if you lose your way, if you find that a passage you're writing has gone wrong, because you can see the crossings out, you can go back and find the point where you took the wrong turning. Do you remember, well, maybe you weren't taught maths this way, but when I was at school, we were being taught maths, the teachers always said, show your workings. Because that way they could see where your calculations had gone wrong. You could pinpoint the moment. It's exactly the same with inky writing. It shows your workings so you can see the process.
Fascinating.
Sometimes you'll suddenly realize a bit you crossed out actually was right, and you can bring it back in. And I do type it up myself because nobody else could cope with my handwriting. I know you're very kind saying it's legible. It really isn't. And I have several magnifying glasses on this desk because quite often I find a word I cannot read. It'll be something crucial and I can't read it, and I have to sort of squint at it. So,
all right.
But then I type it up, I print it out, and then I do another draft in ink on top of the printout. So all the creative work is done with a pen, really.
Oh, so you're doing revisions in ink on the printed version. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So basically what you've said is you spend a year thinking about it, letting it brew, letting it, swirl around in your brain. My question with that is, that's a long time, a year, 8 months, a year, whatever. Aren't you ever afraid you're going to forget the story that's developed in your head?
No, I'm more afraid I'm going to get poor, because the trouble is, if you're a slow writer, you don't get paid so often. I mean, this is the reason Val McDermott is so fantastically fast. She's a rich writer compared to me. You learn after a while. Your brain goes at a certain pace, and that's just the speed I am. So I do a novel about every 3 years, I guess. And in a funny sort of way, the publicity process, the touring around book festivals process, really suits me, because that tends to come at just the point where I have a new novel to think about, but I'm not quite ready to write about it yet. So the hours I'm about to spend sitting on trains, traveling the length and breadth of the country, will be really useful, because I'll be staring out of the window and thinking about these new characters.
Now, with this story obviously being loosely based on Charles Causley and his mother, there are actual events and facts that you knew were going to happen, or that knew had happened. But with a completely fictional novel where you don't have that, you don't have those guideposts, do you already know what's going to happen in your novels before, the key points, when you start, or you just one of those people who goes, oh, here's an idea and let's see where it goes?
I'm a very male writer, I suspect. I map things out.
Oh,
quite obsessively, but I don't stick to them. It's really just for my own sanity. I have to have a roadmap. I have to know roughly where I'm going.
How do you map it out?
Well, I start with the characters. Always, I just map. I grow the characters. Endless notes about who the main characters are, what they've been, where they went to school, what they like eating, what they like in bed, all this stuff, random things. And my plots tend to grow out of those. So in fact, with this novel, although Charles and Laura were real people, I grew them in much the same way. I had to work out what made them tick. And I had to, and although I knew I had to honor the known facts, I knew as well there would be moments where I had to follow my instincts and make stuff up. So crucially, I've given Charles Causley a sex life, which he went to great pains to appear to be a man who'd never had sex in his life. But I was determined to do that and give him a really kind of deep emotional story. I made most of that up, although I did have really good clues I found in his letters and his archive. But ultimately, that was, those were scenes which I was confecting.
But when you say you are quite a male writer and you map things out and you start with those characters, okay, you might start mapping out your things with the characters, but do you on an actual physical level, do you map things out with index cards or Excel spreadsheets or inky flowcharts or something?
Things. Funny enough, this is one of the moments where I do use my computer creatively. I quite often will do a kind of graph with a column for each character. And the horizontal bars across the graph represent the passage of time.
Yes.
And so what I do is I try to map out each character's story on that graph. And so I know whose point of view certain events in the story will be told from. And it's a very useful graphic way, literally graphic way, of checking that the characters have enough material, that they have enough to do, literally. You may suddenly find when you do that there's a character who is purely there in order to enable one scene, at which point I think, well, okay, we ditch that character and we give that scene to somebody else. But it's a funny process, and I very rarely stick to my plan. The plan is largely there as a trick, a way of tricking myself into getting on with it, and to say, oh, it's fine. It's also a very useful scheme if you turn your story into a graph like that. It breaks it down into bite-sized chunks, which are less daunting. I mean, a novel is like a mountain to climb. Yes. Whereas an individual chapter is like a short story. Yes. So you can kid yourself that all you're doing is writing a series of short stories that just happen to be about the same people.
So when you're doing your inky draft, tell me about your day, like your typical writing day, what time you wake up, whether you have a particular routine, you got to have that particular coffee, or whether you have a word count goal, that sort of thing, what time you knock off.
Oh God, I'm very vague, really. I mean, it's a working farm, so we wake up early. We wake up at about 6:30, earlier in the summer, and we have dogs, and the dogs are very much a part of my working day. So I always start my writing day by going for a walk with the dogs, and I end the writing day by going for a walk with the dogs. And I think those dog walks are like my kind of decompression chamber into the novel and out of the novel again. They're a way of me giving myself a chance to think through what I did the day before, what I want to do today, and get ready for it. I then spend hours and hours staring into space, literally. You can see over my shoulder, there's a big blue armchair in the corner. Yes. I sit in that armchair, and if it's a nice day, I'll have the door open to the garden and I stare into space. And quite often I get nothing written until about the last hour of the day, and suddenly ideas will come. It's just really frustrating. Other days it's fantastic and I write loads. I do never ever do a word count. I think word counts are a terrible idea, and I'm horrified when I hear writers say, oh yeah, I try to do 2,500 words a day. I think that's just willy waving, and it's of no help to anybody. And frankly, I'd rather write one paragraph that I'm really proud of than 5.5 pages which are of dubious quality. I don't think word counting really helps.
Okay, what is to you the most rewarding thing about writing novels?
Oh, it's definitely losing myself. I myself disappear for me when I'm working. I get very excited by inhabiting these other people and trying other lives on for size. And one of my editing processes is trying to remove traces of myself that might have crept in. So inevitably, I'm everywhere because your value judgments will seep out into your character's value judgments. But I try to disappear. And another way I do that is by trying to remove from the text anything I'm especially proud of. So if I think there's a bit of writing, if I do a bit of writing, some metaphor, and I think, oh God, that's amazing, it has to go.
What?
Because I don't want to remind the reader they're reading. I want the reader to be as inside the characters as I am. And if you do something that's too clever or too beautiful, it'll remind them they're holding a book in their hands. I want them to forget they're holding a book in their hands. I want them to forget to pick the children up from school because they're so busy reading. So,
well, this book certainly does that. And for those people who discover Patrick Gale, have more recently discovered Patrick Gale, you are the sort of author that you then go back and read your back catalogue. When you finally discover you go, oh my God, I'm going to read everything this guy's ever written. So let's finish on. We always finish on, what are your top 3 writing tips for people who want to be in a position where you are one day?
Well, the first one is read more. You know, it's astonishing how often I meet young people who are starting to write, or they think they want to be a writer, and I always ask them, well, okay, what was the last book you read that really blew your mind? And there's often this terrible pause, and then you realize, oh my God, all they're doing is watching television, they're not reading. I never went to writing school. I did an English degree, and I'm so glad I did, because I spent 3 years reading those huge triple-decker 19th century novels, and those taught me my craft, and I'm still learning. I'm 60 this year. I am still learning how to write, and I'm learning it by reading. So number 1 tip is read more. Number 2 tip is buy yourself a fountain pen and have a go. Seriously, have a go at inky writing, because you will find it life-changing. Not least because it means you can turn off the computer and not be distracted by Google and emails and all that other stuff. You do not need to be looking at pictures of kittens in fancy dress. You should be getting on with your novel. And I think third is to reassure people who think they've got writer's block. I don't think writer's block exists. I think usually when people think they've got writer's block, it's because they've started writing too quickly.
What do you mean writing too quickly?
They've probably had a wonderful idea for a book, and they've jumped in but with both feet first, and they've started writing it.
Right,
what they should do is take a bit more time about going around the edge of their subject. So go away and read some books that relate to the subject. Maybe just spend a week or 2 doing nothing but taking notes about who the characters are. Really, don't push it. I think writer's block tends to happen because you're not yet ready to write the final text. You should still be thinking a way around it.
I love that. And on that note, thank you so much for your time today, Patrick.
Valerie, it's been a dream. Thank you.